Michael.
Hello.
Hello, good afternoon, Michael and team.
Do you guys, hi Badal, do you guys do one to multi, two duplex, triplex, fourplex loans?
Yes, we do.
Can you mention that today since that's what I'm talking about?
Yes, yeah, sure.
I know I didn't give you time to prepare, but
No, I was planning to share like a quick preview of loan guide once you finish your content on your prime, like what the for your webinar. So I'm just planning to show like quick pick of what are the loan, minimum down payment, credit score requirement, like very overview, like one page. And I can share with the team later
oh,
after the call. Yeah. But
uh,
yeah, so I can add that multi-unit one also in that. So that's
it's okay. We just have a few minutes today because the
yeah.
form classes go on and on. But and the answer really is that if they're going to live in one, there isn't any difference in the loan,
Uh,
pretty much.
yeah. So if they're occupying 50% or more, then they can be qualified for primary. If not, then it will be considered as a
Okay.
yeah.
So, in terms of that, I was thinking I could ask you some questions about it, which I didn't mean to pull this on you. So why don't we just do what you're planning on doing? Let's you spend a few minutes doing that and then we'll
No,
dig.
we, no, we can change. Don't worry. Like if you think, yeah, if you think you have few questions, and I can definitely answer.
All right, that's
Yeah.
good. Um, okay. See, I know the questions to ask. Is it time already? Already. So, I guess we're recording this already? I don't have to do anything. I should leave everything alone. Angela, is that correct? Yes. All right. Great. Well, welcome everybody. Today we're going to be talking about something special, the residential income purchase agreement, which may not be exactly what you think. All right. I'm just warning you. And that involves, it's a similar contract. It's like the RPA, but it's RIPA, and there's some significant differences, which we're going to go over today. And to start with, we are pleased to have Badal with Envoy Mortgage, who's going to, is going to talk to us about loans. I'm not 100% sure what he's going to talk about first, but I'm willing to find out with you. Or do you want
Oh,
me? So if I were asking questions, I would ask, does Envoy Mortgage have loans for duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes?
uh, yes, we do. So we have program for primary, residential, single unit, and multi-unit for investment. Multi-unit start from 1 2 to 4. Different program, you get better rate, and 5 to 8 they consider an a commercial we that DSCR loan from 2 to 8. So we have a program just for investment. What is DSCR loan? Topic of next session. It takes 5-10 minutes, but that's investment loan. And if you consider living in one of the unit, where we have programs for that also. So yes, we do have program for those comes in the non-QM. But yes,
And non-QM, that has something to do with the Queen of England, Queen.
that's a good question.
Oh, is that a QM? The
Uh, so QM means qualified mortgage. Government has guidelines of Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac guidelines. So if you comes under those guidelines, those are QM loans. If you don't qualify for those guidelines. Those are non-QM. So most of the time, commercial investment loans part of a non-QM. QM, we have to validate like income more strictly than other programs.
So by commercial versus QM versus investment, does that really mean that the buyer is not going to be living there? So if,
Invest
yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, yes, correct. Investment loan, usually buyer don't live there and they have to sign one document, say, hey, we are not planning to either them or their relatives. So a family or friends will not gonna live in the unit because if they don't pay rent, then the calculation will be disturbed and you will get hard time to pay the mortgage, right? So to avoid those issues, there's a guideline to uh, not ask borrower to live in the unit. If you go in investor route, but if you go in investment with living in one of the unit, there is different program, different guidelines.
If I'm not going to be living in any of the units, does it change the amount of down payment I need?
Usually down payment is 20 to 25% on investment loans. If you are experienced investors, then it goes to 15%. Like if you already have like two or three rental unit, you are managing all the rentals and properties, then you have like better option on going 15%. Sometime we can push for 90 LTV, so 10% down payment. But if you are not experienced investor, but you are experience on home purchase. So at least you will need a primary house and you will be qualified for 20 to 25% of the investment DSCR loans also.
If I'm not getting the standard Fannie Mae, Freddie Mac type loan, investment loans, does that change the interest rate and or loan fees I have?
Not a loan fees, but interest rate definitely changed. So QM loan have a government guideline, and non-QM loan there's a more risk associated with QM loans because we don't have W-2 incomes or we don't have steady income from the business. Then we have to do non-QM loan, and that in that there's a risk associated with the mortgage. So investor usually charge a little bit higher than QM loans. It usually 0.75 to 1% higher than
I should have.
regular loans.
Sorry, I didn't highlight your picture while we were doing this. I'm not. Um,
All
the
good.
it's I'll do that. There you can see what the doll looks. So if I'm what was I going to ask about non-QM interest rate is higher. Uh, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, no, but
No worry. So yeah,
have we covered?
interest rate is around like three quarter or 1% higher than
Oh,
QM loans. Yeah.
I remember this will be my final question about this. Does it ever happen that that somebody is thinking about buying a multi-unit and not living in it, and they have a pre-approval letter that they got from a lender that has a very high number, but the lender didn't know at the time they were writing the pre-approval letter that they were writing it for a non-owner occupied investment property, and so the numbers are all wrong. Is that a likely, am I the only one that has seen that?
Well, I think I've seen it, but if we've seen it, then someone did a bad job on
Right.
communication or like it's my responsibility to get right
Right.
information from the customer to make sure what is the right program. Like there are like hundred of programs, so we have to make
Yeah.
sure that it's a right program. So if it happens, then loan officer's responsibility to make sure
Okay.
you get the right information. Yeah.
Sounds good. Have we done enough? Have I tortured you enough for today? Is there anything else you want to say, or can I?
No, I think we
Right.
are fine. Like, yeah, we are fine. Yeah.
So first of all, I want everybody to, people go they have a bank and they are thinking about buying a duplex, a triplex. And so they call the loan agent at the bank and they say, I'm going to need to get pre-approved because I may be buying something. And the loan agent pre-approves them for a regular, I'm going to move in and live there, purchase of a single family home. And they write them a pre-approval letter. And now the buyer has this pre-approval letter, but as you've learned, that isn't necessarily going to help them when it comes time to buying a non-owner occupied investment type property. So you want to make sure that when your buyer has talked to their lender, they made it very clear that they were not planning on living there and that it was going to be used, and that it may be multifamily. Now, what I also didn't know, this is why I like listening to Badal every week, is that they have loans for 5 to 8 units. Now, many lenders do not. 1 to 4 is sort of considered all like each other. And what I mean is that 1 to 4 units, there's a transfer disclosure statement, there's a RESPA, the Real Estate Settlement Procedures Act applies, truth in lending applies. There's all these laws and things that kick in. When you hit 5 units, the classification becomes commercial, no transfer disclosure statement, right? In fact, one of the few required disclosures in 5 or more is a natural hazard disclosure. But there's no TDS, right? It's not required. There's no RESPA laws. There's no closing disclosure. It's just it's different. So that gives you a little flexibility because if somebody wants to go from 4 to 5, it would be good to have a lender that could actually make the loan to 5. So what we're going to do today is we're going to, I wanted to start off so that you understood the loan thing. See if I'm, so first thing we're going to do, we're going to write an offer today on a residential income purchase. Now, to start with, we're going to find one. I've shared, or Angela has, I hope, a document, I'm sure she has, that looks like this. And it has a link to a sample form in case your zip forms is broken. And then it has some information. I'm going to concentrate on filling out a form. Now, if listen to this. If a single family house being purchased by an investor, not duplex, not triplex, not fourplex, and the current owner has a tenant in the property paying rent, and the buyer does not intend on kicking the tenant out, but is going to keep it as a rental, that's when this form is used. It could be a single family. It could be a condo. It could be a townhouse. It could be a duplex, triplex, or fourplex. If there's a tenant in the property now, who's going to stay? Right? You understand that it's not, duplexes and triplexes, single family homes currently rented. Then I've been asked, well, let's say the single family home isn't rented. There's no tenant in it, but the buyer I have is intending to rent it and produce income. Should we use the RIPA form? And the answer is no. No, because after they own it, they can do what they want. What RIPA is mostly about is making sure that you get all of the necessary tenant type income and expense disclosures. So I found a multifamily listing in the city of San Jose. There's quite a few. And I'm looking at it in the MLS. Most 1 to 4 of these kind of properties are in the multiple listing service. There's no particular interesting private information, but down here is something we might want to pay attention to because there's a section that tells us this is a triplex, for the different units, how much the rent is, right? Bedrooms and bathrooms. Tells us the rent. Okay, that's the current rent. Can you raise the current rent by any amount you want once ownership changes? The answer is no, right? Rent control, right? So you need to start with this as perhaps a baseline. Then, if you're doing this for rental purposes, how many of you have heard of capitalization of net operating income and all that sort of stuff? Right? Well, that's how you can value income properties. There's two ways of valuing a triplex or a fourplex. One is market data, which looks at sales of similar triplexes and fourplexes in that area, and sometimes there aren't any other sales. The other way is the income approach, which based upon the net operating income and the rate of return that investors expect in today's market. And by the way, I think next week I'm going to do the session on how to evaluate income properties. Right. But I'll give you a little snippet right now. Looking at this expense report, right? This is the first one I pulled up, right? I wasn't searching around. But looking at that expense report, it purports to say their net income is about $88,000. Now, loans are not included in this discussion, right? Loans are a personal expense that somebody may or may not have. So there's no loan factored into this, but the buyer may have one. That's why we're going to talk about internal rate of return next week. Doesn't that sound exciting? Which is a method used to evaluate property. And is there anything, this isn't a complicated list, anything jumping out at any of you that is missing from this list? Right, remember, we're not talking about loans, right? That's off the table. There's taxes and insurance, right? Landscaping, maintenance, and management, 0, 0, 0, 0. Trash is $300. That looks pretty complete. Why do you think the management expense is zero? Probably because the owner manages it. Does that mean there's no management expense? The answer is no. Because is the owner's time worth anything? Could they get a job as a greeter at Walmart? Right? Could they find somebody that would pay them something for their time? If that's true, then there is a management expense. Will the buyer necessarily want to manage it themselves? The answer is no. Those of you that have represented investors know they don't want to manage it themselves a lot. How much would it cost to hire a professional manager? It could be 10%. So the management fee, which isn't in the current books, which may be in your books, it ain't there. Do you think that the air conditioning system will never break? The roof will never leak? The refrigerators will never cease to refrigerate? Right? All of those things are going to break and wear out. Carpets are going to need to be replaced. That's called reserves for replacement. There's nothing there. Then it says vacancy factor is 0%. That's because it hasn't been vacant for years. Is that a guarantee that it'll never be vacant in the future? That the tenants all will pay their rent on time? That you'll never have to evict anyone ever? Does that sound like a reasonable future assumption to make? Probably not. So a lot of times we would add in another factor. Does everybody understand that this is why we want more time than we would have in a normal purchase agreement? Because all this stuff we're going to need to figure out. Also, the property taxes are based upon current assessed value. Well, what's that? They're going to reassess as soon as this transaction occurs if it's gone up in value. So that number, you understand why we could talk more about this. And for those of you that love to, think ahead, do that sort of stuff, in RPR, this is the same property. And usually when I'm writing an offer, I would look at both. And over here on the right is what I'll mention next week is, I think I'm going to do this next week, which is a program called Valuate, which is a program that we would use to evaluate rental properties. All right, and you can do flips and you can do holds. All right. So here it is. Now I'm looking at it. Let's get busy, right? What am I going to do? Well, I'm going to copy the MLS number, right? I'm going to copy the MLS number. I think I've also copied that, the address, and then I'm going to find zip forms. Here we go. So you're in zip forms, you've copied the MLS number. If it's not if you don't have an MLS number, because it's, could somebody mute?
Yeah, and they double wrapped it. Like this, I ordered this one for you.
Can you,
So cool.
let me see if I can find. All right, I'm gonna mute it. That must be Helen. All right. There we go. I'm going to mute everybody except me for a while, okay? But unmute yourself if you want to yell at me. All right. So we want to copy, if it's in the MLS, we copy the MLS number. If it's not in the multiple listing server,
Cannot hear you, Mike.
I'm not muted. Okay, is it true that Manoj just said he can't hear me? Is
I can hear you
anybody?
now.
I can hear you.
All right, you could hear me before too? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So the property you're writing an offer on is either in the MLS or it's not in the MLS. If it's in the MLS, it's easier because you copy the MLS number. If it's not in the MLS, you would copy the address and we would use a program called Property Connect. Or in RPR, there's a way of moving the data directly into zip forms. For easiness, I picked one that's in the MLS. So I'm going to click on New Transaction, New Offer to Purchase. And I'm going to call this a very RIPA demo, right? And the street address, all that kind of stuff. But notice over here, it's MLS Connect. So I'm going to click on that and I'm going to paste in the MLS number. And I'm going to, it never does anything with the photo, but I don't know, I like that it can find one. And it says it's an invalid listing ID. Well, that's interesting. MLA, it's got probably an extra space at the end. Invalid listing ID. Well, that's so, as I was saying, we also could copy the address. All I have to do is find the right, close that. Too many tabs. And I'm going to find. All right, so we've got the address also. This I did not think would take that long, this part. So we're going to just drop in the address. We can go ahead and make it look better. 95112. Back out that. And notice it also says Zip Form Record Connect. Ooh, I'm going to click on that. Now, the reason we wanted the MLS number is because if it were working, it would import the information in the MLS into our form. So we wouldn't have to be copying and pasting all this stuff. Now, both RPR and Record Connect are going to try to do the same thing. We're going to say it's a multi-unit. Now, you should have created a template for you to represent a buyer, which would be your information and your broker's information. And we're now going to save it. And I sure hope it works. All right. So notice what it's done is that it has looked at what the title records say. The assessor's data says who owns it. And a lot of times the names of the owners get inverted. So this is either Inc. BBMT, or most likely it is BBMT Incorporated. Is everybody still there? I don't know. All of the videos disappeared. I'm feeling lonely. I guess so. All right, no, it's fine. I thought you'd all left me. So I'm going to fix it so the name looks more proper. I'm going to click on yes. And what it's now done is it's imported as much of that information as it can. All right. Now, that doesn't mean it's going to be perfect, but we're going to go to documents and we're going to add a document and we're going to go to forms and we're going to go to CAR forms and we're going to type in RIPA and we're going to find the residential income purchase agreement. And then we're going to stop it. And then the other thing you would be having to do, which is easier actually when you're doing it from the transaction. It's easier when you're doing it from the transaction. I clicked too fast, so I'm going to go back. Don't mess with me today. All right. Is to go to parties and you have to put in the names of the buyer, right? Because it's not there automatically. Now, if you've been using, if they're in your Google Contacts, you could bring them in, you could put them in as a transaction, as a zip forms contact, you can use all these other different ways, but you're going to need to get the buyer's information. If the buyer is an LLC, which is oftentimes more likely, this is not really designed easily for it, but let's say your LLC is MD Group LLC. So what I've done is I've just split it up into the three parts. All right, it'll put it all together. You could type it all in first name, but it seems happier this way, and if it's happy, I'm happy. You would then you can put in address and city and state and zip code. It doesn't populate anywhere. Doesn't populate anywhere. So, I don't know. Go for it. Business fax, I don't know who uses that. Cell phone doesn't populate anywhere. Business, nothing. What will be useful maybe is if we have an email address. Now, the issue here is that MD Group LLC is a legal entity and therefore by itself isn't going to sign anything. So then we would go down here where it says signing representative and we would put it in, and then here and then we put in our email. Cell phone, go ahead, it doesn't go anywhere. So what this is going to do is where it comes to signing, it's going to have the name of the human who is authorized to sign on behalf of the corporation. But when it comes to name of buyer, the buyer is not that human. The buyer is this entity, this corporation. Any questions about that? All right. Isn't this fun? All right, so we didn't put in the buyers because I'm lazy and I didn't want to do that much. So I'm going to, I'm not going to make up buyers right now. So let's look at the contract. Yay. All right. Now, I'm assuming you're somewhat familiar with the RPA. If you had the buyers, more information, you check to make sure that, it knows that that's the agency signature. This is the second page is a copy of the California Civil Code section. I tell people to read it if they have insomnia. Now we've gotten to the RPA. We would usually start with the day that we are writing it. That is not the same thing as the day the offer is signed. It is not the same thing as the day the offer is accepted. It is the day it's prepared. This is an important date because other forms throughout the transaction are going to refer to the RIPA dated this date, right? And it can be the day before, the day after. So this, you would check the appropriate boxes. It's an LLC. Now, notice because of our Record Connect, it pulled in the assessor's parcel number. I didn't know what that was, right? You understand? That's a number it pulled from the public records. This is very important. I've got a couple of transactions, one of them going now where there's 2 units on a parcel, a duplex maybe, 2 units, but they look like they're one. There's 2 legal lots, but it looks like it's one parcel. And so what it has is one assessor's parcel number, but it's multiple legal lots. Because if you've got 2 legal lots next to each other and you're using them for the same purpose, like a fourplex or triplex, even though they're legally 2 lots next to each other, the tax assessor will assess them as one taxable parcel. This is one of the more fun things in this, because it's sometimes not too clear. Right, because somebody bought 2 parcels and they've stuck them, they merged, they assembled them together, and then they built one big building. You need the assessor's parcel number, right? It's very important to make sure we're writing an offer on the right property. Now, if we were able to do the MLS Connect, which as you saw didn't work, it would have imported the listing broker's information also. But
Mike has a question, Mike.
yeah.
Quick question for you. Say you were buying a condo building and each unit has a parcel number and then there's a master parcel number. Are you putting all of those in or just the master parcel number?
Well, you can't, if you're buying the building, right, which is, you're not buying the individual condos. They're owned by other people who may not want to sell to you. If you're saying you're buying the homeowner association, right, the ownership of the common areas. So the common areas, the pool and all of that sort of stuff, and the landscaping, the parking lot is owned in common by the homeowner association, which usually has created a corporation for the management of it. So why would you buy that? I guess you could buy that. But people rarely buy that. They buy the condos, but why do you want to own the association? They don't make very much money.
Yeah, I was just curious, like there was a building that was apartments and then they purchased basically the whole building and sold it out basically.
That's different. That's called a condo conversion. So a condominium is essentially an apartment that somebody got the idea of selling all the apartments rather than renting them. So you buy an apartment building and then you convert it to condominium, which doesn't mean you physically do anything, but it's filing a bunch of papers, and then each unit gets its own parcel number, its own legal definition, as well as an assessor's parcel number. All right.
Okay, so all that would happen after the purchase.
Yeah.
Got it. Thanks.
Yeah. So, all right. Any other questions? So I'm not going to, go look it up, but sometimes even with MLS Connect, it doesn't always bring over the license number. So we need the name of the listing broker. How about my favorite, Bag of Chips Realty, and we could put in there, and then we would say they represent the seller, and then their top agent, right, is and we put in their license number, and then eXp Realty represents the buyer, and we put in their license number and my license number, and is there more than one brokerage representing anybody in this transaction? And then when you get into more commercial, this happens more often, where you see, and in fact, eXp has relaxed their policies in many ways in May, one of them being that working cooperatively with other non-eXp brokers is now allowed, where it wasn't really before. But if that were true, you would check that box. Most of this looks like the regular RPA, but I'm going to focus on some of the special ones, the differences. You would put in the price. If it's all cash, check it, close of escrow, usually longer. So if you can close in 30 days, let's say on a single family owner occupied, your lender is saying I can fund in 21, easy. Sometimes they're saying we could do it in 12. This isn't going to work on a triplex or a fourplex. And one of the reasons is because when we get to due diligence and contingencies, it is far less likely that they have a termite inspection, property inspection, or any of that stuff on a triplex or a fourplex. And the reason is because there's tenants in the property. And in order to have those inspections, you have to sort of dislocate the tenants long enough in order to do the inspections, which is a very difficult thing to do because they don't want it. So what we would typically do oftentimes is when you're writing an offer on a especially multifamily tenant occupied property is we make the offer subject to inspection. So in other words, you may not, when you're writing this offer, have even seen the inside of any of the units. Usually the only way we can see the inside of a unit is if the owner lives in one. You understand the owner is not going to tell the tenants, I'm giving you 24-hour notice for every single showing and having it happen every other day. No. They're not going to do that. They're going to say, if you're interested, you're making the decision based upon the income and expenses of the property, right? That's the whole thing, right? It's an income property. So what do you care? You make an offer, the offer is accepted, and only when you're serious do you get to see it. And by the way, that's the day the appraisal is usually done. You try to do everything on one day because it's hard to get the tenants, you got to give them notice. It's a hassle. Right. So 45 days would probably be more reasonable. Could be. There's also a lot more different stuff to check. Expiration of the offer, there isn't much else different between this and the RPA. Initial deposit used to be a big thing a really long time ago. Haven't seen one in decades. You probably will never need to use the initial deposit and increased deposit. Is there going to be a loan on the property? Okay. Now, a different conversation will be, I'm going to do this because I'm getting more of it, seller financing, right? I thought I'd do a class on that as well, but you can see there's more choices than you normally have. You would put in the loan information. Can you get an FHA or a VA loan? I think Badal's probably still here, but a hypothetical. Can you get one on a how about this? Can you get one on a multi-unit property? Could you get an FHA loan or a VA loan to buy a duplex? Are you there, Badal?
Yes, I'm here. So multi-unit property, FHA, I think FHA is limited for 2 unit, uh, where 1 unit can be occupied by the borrower. But I can I think we don't. I can cross check. I can get more detail. Yeah, but
My understanding,
FHA covers up to 4 units.
what did, I didn't hear all that.
FHA covers up to 4 units.
Right.
4 units. Okay, so
both,
but
both FHA and VA will allow you to get a loan on multi-unit property if the buyer is going to live in 1 unit.
correct. One of the unit has to occupy by the buyer. Correct.
All right. So, but does everybody understand you're going to want to get the whole financing thing worked out before you're filling this out? Now, occupancy type, this is something that you don't see in the RPA. It doesn't ask it here. So is it in the RPA default setting is that you're going to be buying the property and living in it. That's the default setting. The RIPA default setting is you're not going to be living in the property. Hence, it's a RIPA. So you would check the box. Does that really matter? Well, we've heard about the loans. Is there anything else that changes besides the loans if we are an investment as opposed to a primary as to a primary residence. Anything else? If you knocked your coffee over and it stained your good pants, you would have liquidated damages, wouldn't you? Something like that. Sorry about that. Liquidated damages. Does everybody know what that in the residential purchase agreement, there's a clause that says that if the buyer defaults and the buyer doesn't have a reason, they've defaulted, the buyer could lose their deposit, but only up to 3% of the purchase price. That only applies to owner-occupied properties. It does not apply to investment properties. So which means that the owner, and I actually had one in a duplex in Cupertino where they wanted like 10% non-refundable, right? You understand? You're not getting your money back. And they could keep all 10% if we hadn't closed, which we almost didn't. They could have kept all 10% or tried to, because the liquidated damage restrictions do not apply if it's not owner occupied. Is there going to be a credit to the seller? That's not much difference. There could be credit to the buyer. There could be other credit. Why would you be having, well, the first one, G1, is for usually closing costs, whereas G2 could be something like an interest rate buy down, right? Which is not kind of a closing cost, but kind of not. And G3 is the payment of the seller of the buyer's broker's compensation. This isn't any different than it was in the RPA. Any questions? I think Angela's watching the questions. I'm glad. Verification of all cash, verification of down payment, verification, all of this is the same. Final verification of condition, assignment request, that's the same. Contingencies, they're all 17 days, just like the RPA. There isn't much here that's different. And when we get to investigation of the property, we're going to get to this in a moment. What's also different, oh, here it is 8H. So something that is in the RIPA that is not in the RPA is the section on the review of leased or liened items. That's not right. It's up in the investigation. We're going to get to it when we get to the paragraph. I'm ahead of myself. The difference between the two in terms of investigation is that the RPA doesn't mention anything about tenants or leases or estoppel certificates. The RIPA, which assumes that a tenant is there, has as a contingency the buyer's acceptance review of the leases, what's called an estoppel certificate, and to be able to check all of those expenses out to make sure that, there really isn't any more. What else would we have here that's different? That's what I wanted to focus on. Vacant units, tenant occupied, subject to tenant rights. If there is a unit that, let's say all of them are occupied right now, the buyer might want to live in one. And so the buyer might want the owner to get one of the units vacated prior to close of escrow. That is normally handled in a RPA with the TOPA form, the Tenant Occupied Property Addendum. And that's the part of the RPA that we use to handle tenants and their rights. And then you could say in the TOPA form, I want it to be vacant, or you could even say it here in the RIPA. And you oftentimes notice it says on the additional terms, units to be delivered vacant. And then the topo form, when you click that, launches. All right, I'm buying a triplex. I want to live in one. Can the current owner kick out the one I want to live in? Can they kick out that tenant? Because they're planning on selling it, and I want to live in one of the units. Can the current owner do that? And the answer is no. Because I want to sell it without you in it is not one of the just cause evictions. But I thought that if the buyer was going to live in it, they could kick the tenant out. And the answer is yeah. But the question is, who can kick the tenant out? And when can they kick the tenant out? The current owner is not planning on living in the unit. The current owner does not have the right to kick out the tenant because they want to move in. They don't want to move in. The buyer is the one that wants to move into the unit, but the buyer doesn't own the unit right now. So the buyer has to own the unit before the buyer can exercise their right to move in. And then it requires the buyer to give the tenant 60 days notice. Sometimes they don't even leave in 60 days. So as a practical matter, we do the topo form where we tell the current owner, you got to get that tenant out. And well, he doesn't want to move. Well, yeah, but you should tell him this, that regardless, he's going to have to leave. But if he leaves early, we'll give him, well, first of all, you're required, if you kick the tenant out because you want to move in, to give the tenant 1 month's rent as a relocation allowance, which is usually done through the refunding of their deposit. You just have to give them, you don't charge them last month's rent, you give them their deposit back and tell them to leave. Many times you have to bribe the tenant, give them 2 months rent, pay them off so that they will voluntarily leave before escrow closes. Because if they don't, and the buyer wants to live in any of the unit, it becomes messier, right? Months is what it will take. So that's where we would put in and a lot of times they want to live in one of the units. They heard on the internet, live in one unit, rent out the others, get them to pay your mortgage, live for free, right? That's what they've heard. Seller occupied units are to be delivered vacant. Unless for some reason they want to become a renter, then you would start all over. Deliver of documents. This isn't much different. So I'm not going to spend a lot of time on it. NHD is required just about everywhere, right? Commercial, multifamily, it doesn't matter. There could be a wildfire disclosure, which would involve the fire hardening and defensible space, which is another topic. There's all of the normal stuff here, which I'm not going to spend a lot of time on. It's just how you would normally fill it out. Home warranties are possible for fourplexes, triplexes, duplexes. That's fine. And what we also want, notice in R, additional tenancy documents, income and expense, and a tenant estoppel certificate. So what's that? Well, it says in the MLS that they're renting these units out for $3,000, $2,500, and $3,100. All right. So it says in the contract that the landlord has to give us copies of all the leases that's coming up so we can check. What's missing? Do you think it's possible that one of the tenants that was paying $3,000 a month went to the landlord at some point and said, hey, they've just put in these new apartments around the corner. They look really nice. And they're about $3,000 a month also. But they're new. They're nicer. And so I'm thinking, why am I paying you $3,000 a month for this old place when there's one around the corner that's nicer and newer for the same price? And the landlord says, okay, what do you want? And the tenant says, how about $2,500? Landlord says, okay. Now, Did they rewrite the lease at that moment, do you think? Most of the time not. So the lease, if you read the lease, says the tenant pays $3,000 a month, but the tenant's not paying $3,000 a month. They're only paying $2,500 a month. What the tenant estoppel certificate asks the tenant is, how much rent are you really paying? Landlord says that, who's paying the utilities, who's paying the garbage? We also ask the tenant how much of a security deposit did they give. Landlord says, well, I only got 1 month as a security deposit. And the tenant says, no, I paid 2. I can prove it. All right, and that's what the tenant estoppel certificate is. And of course, if you're trying to make money, you'd like to know what the income and expenses are. What other things might come up? Mixed use purchase addendum. I sold some property where downstairs was retail space, office and retail. Upstairs were townhomes and condominiums. And when you bought it, you were buying both the residential income as well as the non-residential commercial. One package, special zoning. Well, there's a form for that. That's called the mixed use purchase addendum, because you got to make sure that this is really legal, right? And there's a lot of that, and sometimes this is very popular. There's certain areas where there's quite a few of these. What else is on this list that might be, well, look at the one about buyer intent to exchange. Is your buyer doing a 1031 exchange? If the answer is yes, then you're going to check the box. If the answer is no, you don't check the box. Assume financing, that's really hard to do. Seller intent to exchange, if it says in the MLS the seller is doing a 1031 exchange, it would be prudent for you, if you're writing an offer, to check this box. Because if I'm the listing agent and my client is doing a 1031 exchange, I will insist that your offer include a seller intent to exchange addendum. And what that addendum says is that the buyer agrees to cooperate with the seller's 1031 exchange. And if the buyer doesn't cooperate, which doesn't cost the buyer any money, they just have to sign a form. But if the buyer doesn't cooperate, they could be liable for damages that the seller incurs, which is usually the payment of capital gains tax. So you would be looking at the MLS. You would want to talk to the listing agent. So why are they selling the property? What's going on? Tell me as much as you can. What are they looking for? What can we do? My client's very interested. Tell me what you need. All right, that sort of thing. And if they mention and they're doing an exchange, you put that in. What else did I want to do? Let's look at paragraph 8 are contingencies. Most of these are the same. 8C is the big contingency. It's both in the RPA as well as the RIPA. And it says this agreement is contingent upon buyer's acceptance of the condition of and any other matter affecting the property. Now look at that. Buyer's acceptance of the condition and any other matter affecting the property. That's a pretty wide open contingency. All right, if you have a 17-day investigation contingency, it almost is like saying if you change your mind, you can back out. Review of seller's document, you get a prelim. If it's in a condominium, you get that. Leased or liened items refers to solar panels primarily. It could be propane tanks. Removal or waiver of contingencies with offer. If you make a non-contingent offer, which is you check a box and add another form, this is really telling you it's a dangerous thing to do, right? Until the seller has provided all the required documents, reports, disclosures, and information, right? Don't remove the contingency if they haven't given you everything. Sale of property, that's pretty much the same. Items included in the sale, paragraph, let's see, let's go to paragraph 12. So this is probably the biggest difference between the residential income purchase agreement and the residential purchase agreement is the dealing with tenancy and tenancy disclosures. So the seller has to give the buyer the leases, the rent roll, service contracts, income, expense reports. Estoppels, as I mentioned, are mentioned here, estoppel certificates, which is the, validation by the tenant that that's really what's going on. Changes during escrow. This is also different than the RPA. The RPA doesn't assume that the current owner is going to be doing weird stuff during escrow. Like what? Well, leasing out the property, signing a new lease. So what happens if in the triplex one of the units goes vacant while you're in contract and the current owner decides to rent it out for you? At what rate? Is it your rate? Is it their rate? It says they can't do that, right? They have to tell the buyer if they're going to rent or lease or change, modify, alter, extend, or do anything during escrow with the existing leases. Security deposits and unearned rent. The seller has to transfer the deposits and notify the tenant. That's different than the RPA. And the buyer would be credited for prepaid rent at closing. Yeah. This is something that the escrow officer can help with. You could study it. If you're on my team, you could ask me to explain it to someone. But I'll give it a go here. If you're buying income property, you have some things that are paid beyond the day escrow closes, and you have some things that are paid short of the day that escrow closes. What would be something that is paid short? And the answer would be interest that's on like a loan that is going to be assumed, because interest is charged at the end of the month for the previous month's use of the money. What is charged prior to escrow closing is rent. So the triplex, the tenants pay rent at the beginning of the month. But let's say escrow closes in the middle of the month. Now, if you're the buyer, you would have owned the triplex for half of a month, and you would deserve half of the rent for that month from all those tenants. Right? So the landlord would prorate the prepaid, which is now unearned, right? Because they didn't own it for the second half, and that would be credited. Does that make sense? All right, anyhow. Buyer's investigation. This is pretty much the same. What we're going to, did I already skip the other thing? I'll just do one more for fun. Oh, I guess it's 17. 37. It's a 7. It's been one of those days. The other part that can become a big difference is this section here, paragraph 37, liquidated damages. So as I mentioned before, if the buyer is going to occupy the property as a personal residence, the liquidated damages can be no more than 3%. So sometimes buyers put down 10% or 8% or whatever just to show that they're serious, but you know that you'll get back everything except for 3%. That does not apply if it's not going to be owner occupied. So that if it's more than 3%, they could lose more than 3%. This is different. The wording is different, right? Because the rule is a little bit different. And then arbitration and what's really the difference here? Everybody has to agree to arbitration. It's binding and final. There's a mediation. This isn't very much different. Now, that's, as we scroll, we're getting to the end of the contract where the buyer signs, you'll notice here's where offer, entity buyers, if we're an LLC, we would click on it. We would put in the full legal name of the entity. We would put in the name of the authorized signer. If there's more than one, we would put them in. Put in the name, all right. And then notice down here, signed by, that would be my name. Right? And then, so the name of the buyer is the LLC, but, I'm signing for it. All right. Questions about that? All right, most of this stuff is the same. I don't have any jokes. Buyer's intent to exchange addendum, I put that in. Sellers, I dropped those in because if we were doing it. All right. Let's see, what else? So in this handout, I give you 1 to 4 units. If it's got a tenant and the tenant is going to stay, you would use RIPA. 5 or more units, we oftentimes would not use RIPA, but we would use, there is a CAR has a commercial and multifamily residential purchase agreement, because at 5, it's now a commercial property. And the rules change on commercial properties. The loans change, it changes, right? Disclosures change, everything changes. So the RIPA, I mentioned here, used for existing property with existing tenants, or the buyer won't occupy a unit. Make sure you fill out, look at all the fields. These are all the other documents that you're probably going to be having to deal with. Notice one of them, which you might want to read in advance if you're representing the buyer, is the buyer should understand the rent cap and just cause eviction rules in California. Because they may be thinking, well, I'm going to move in, kick out all the tenants, or I'm just going to raise the rent. I don't know. You can't buy too much. Any local disclosures, does your county or city have their own rent control? San Jose does. They have their own rent control. If you buy a property in Fremont versus buying a property in San Jose, the rules are different. Right? The rules, if you buy them in Berkeley, much more different. So as an agent representing the buyer, one of the things you would want to research is, are there any local rent control laws that might affect the property? Like some of them won't let you Airbnb it. And sometimes the guys think, well, I've got 3, I can Airbnb them, I'll make all this money. Maybe they won't let you do that. You need to check all that. The RCSD is that's not as necessary. If I were thinking about it more carefully, I would have left it out. But it's the representative capacity signature disclosure. But what at some point, you're going to need the trust certificate or the LLC agreement. Do you need that from the buyer when you write the offer? The answer is no. In fact, is this my form? Yeah, I'm going to delete that for now, because we don't usually give that with the offer. Who cares about seeing a copy of the trust certificate or the LLC documents? The answer is the title company, the escrow company. They're going to want it. So we normally don't bother to get it and collect it and do all that stuff until our offer has been accepted. We don't bother, right? But then once the offer is accepted, the buyer is going to have to get that information to the escrow company so that they believe that this person is authorized to buy property. Anyhow, and I've gone through and I've made some others. of some of the most, common things that are missing, a comparison of the two, and a little checklist about, because I have free time. So if that was fascinating to you, what would be maybe what I would like to add to it is, well, next week we'll do, how do you evaluate these properties? If you had a client and the client was saying, well, what's it worth? And you don't have comps because there aren't as many sales of duplexes, triplexes, and fourplexes, let's say. And you understand somebody buying it to live in it is a different value than somebody buying it as a rental. And because the person buying it as a rental is going to be looking at the return on their investment rather than it's got a nice, view. Any questions before we go? Was that? You excited if we do the evaluation next week? I guess so.
And Michael, I think I can bring the DSCR calculation next week, so it will align.
Yes, this would be a good one for yeah.
Yeah.
At least I'm warning you now what I'm doing, not just springing it on you.
That's
Okay,
fine.
but what's the but anyhow, that's great.
Hey, Michael, did you see my review? You keep on asking review. I did give you a nice review.
Oh, was that the 2-star one?
No, well, that was 10 stars actually.
10 stars. Well, thank you very much. We really appreciate it.
Come on. Thank you too.
All right.
Thank you, Michael. This is very helpful.
All right. And if you're on my team and you need one of these, Ra, the transaction coordinator, and I know how to fill out these forms. We'll also do one on seller financing. Because I'm seeing a lot more of that. But
I think become buyer's market now,
Right.
so seller finance is more common, and that so loan is triggered by contract. So just for all the agents, anything goes in contract that will convert into loan and escrow details. So just make sure that it's accurate and all the numbers goes back into the contract.
Sounds good. Have a great day, everybody.
Bye.
I'm going to crawl out the window and go to the beach.
Happy 4th of July.
All right. Have a good one, everybody.
Thank you, Michael.
Thank you, Mike.
Take care.
Bye.
Bye.